Hello, coders. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It is episode 207 of the How to Code Well podcast, and it is the 9th of November 2024. Wow. Today we're going to be talking about, it's going to be a heavy PHP episode today. We're going to be when isn't it a heavy PHP episode, I hear you ask. We're going to be talking about PHP 8.4. We're going to be talking about some Symfony security advisories, and I want to do a little explainer on the API first approach. Woo! So yes, we've got quite a lot to get through. As always, I should mention that this is completely and utterly live, and you may hear some odd barks off the dogs. We've got 2 English Springer Spaniels, and they are roaming around downstairs, so hopefully they'll keep nice and quiet. But I may have to shoot off during the stream. I always have to say this just in case I do. Also, if you want to get involved in the chat, then please do consider being a YouTube member, because this is a members only chat. Once the podcast is done, I'm going to set this as unlisted and offer it to the members, or set it as members only, for probably the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then I will publish this on Spotify and all the other places you can get your podcasts from. And of course, publish this to YouTube as well. But if you want early access to this, plus all the other tutorials and courses that I've got, then please do consider being a member. Right. We have a lot to discuss. Things have moved quite a bit in the PHP space. The first thing we're going to talk about today is PHP 8.4. PHP 8.4 will be released on November the 21st, this month, this year. This is happening. 8.4. It brings in a series of changes. And the first being, I have a list here, and what I'll do is I'll go to the browser, and I'll just, as I discuss these, I'll take you to them, take you to the RFCs. So the first one we have is property hooks. Property hooks. It is this is the RFC here. For those listening, what I'm going to do is I'll just discuss this, and then in the show notes I'll provide links to what it is that I'm seeing. So here we have the RFC for property hooks going into PHP 8.4. Developers often use methods to wrap and guard access to object properties. There are several highly common patterns for such logic, which in practice may be verbose to implement repeatedly. Alternatively, developers may use the get and set magic methods to intercept reads and writes generically, but this leads to a sledgehammer approach that intercepts all undefined and some defined properties unconditionally. Property hooks provide a more targeted, purpose-built tool for common property interactions. This sounds awesome. I will be interested to play around with this. I haven't obviously played around with any of this because I don't have PHP 8.4, but what I would love to do is create some sort of like little tutorials, guide tips, I don't know, where I can go through some of these, because there are a good set of changes in here which I think is going to change the way in which we code PHP going forward. So this one here, property hooks, what we've got here is a user class, and then as of PHP 8.3, if the type enforcement is the only need, that can be abbreviated all the way down to, and this is an example of property promotion. So we have a public string and name here, and then it discusses using property hooks. So that is much nicer, but comes at a cost if we later want to add additional behavior such as validation or pre-processing. There's nowhere to do so, right? So what we're doing here is altering the magic method of get and set to provide some form of validation for the properties. So re-add the get name and set name methods to make the property private or protected. This would be an API break. And the next one is to use the get and set magic methods as shown below. This is a verbose, ugly, error-prone, and breaks static analysis tools. Yes, that's correct. So this is how one would perhaps do it if we were to use property promotion, and we would use the get and set to do some validation on the setting and getting of these variables. And then so down here would be the example, I suppose, of how we would do that through property hooks. I'll leave links to this. I'll definitely leave links to this because there is, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it is huge. It's a huge RFC as well as the other ones as well, and they need some thorough investigation. I am yet to play with all of this stuff, so at the moment I just want to let people know that these are coming down the pipe. We've got an example here of the gets, and should have an example of the set of how to do it using property hooks. So setting and getting using the set and get without the underscore. That's how one would do it. It actually looks, in my opinion, far more readable. We've got the public, it's the method, public, and then string full name, and we're setting the value with the first name and last name and exploding it with a space in between. That seems far more readable than the crazy example right at the top here, where we were doing some crazy mechanics somewhere up here again. Here we go. This ballsy switch statement. Right. Okay. So that's the first one, and the second one that we're going to talk about is this one's a bit of a small one, but actually it's quite huge. It's the using or instantiating classes without the need for any parentheses. So here we go. So what we've got here, what I mean by that is when you say, let's say we're instantiating an object, right? So we're creating a variable, and we're saying that needs to be an instantiation of, say, the request, and we then put that within some parentheses. So we would have parentheses, and in the parentheses we would have new request, right? And then after the parentheses we can then call upon the method. So we've got here with method example, for instance. We can now do this without the parentheses. So all this RFC is doing is removing those parentheses. You may think, well, hang on, that's quite small, but actually the less code that we have to read without it being too abstract means that we are able to read the code easier and faster, in my opinion. So there is no need now to add the parentheses or have an object that we're instantiating, so new request inside parentheses, if we want to call upon a method straight away. There's no need for that. And there are other things to do with the constants and how we call those as well. Again, I need to go through all of this. This is a very thorough, in-depth RFC. I'll definitely provide a link to this one as well. And then the next one is something that I really don't know much about, and that is the asymmetric visibility. Let's have a little read on this one. I'll just load this up in a browser, bear with. Okay, so PHP has long had the ability to control visibility of object properties, public, private, and protected. However, this control is always the same for both get and set operations. That is, they are symmetric. This RFC proposes to allow properties to have separate asymmetric visibility with separate visibility for read and write operations. The syntax is mostly borrowed from Swift, which I applaud. And we've got some examples here of how one does it. Again, I'm going to need to have a little play with this, and then once I've got my teeth into it, I think I'm going to create some tutorial explainer of how this works. And again, as you can see or hear or tell, this is one of those changes that will perhaps change the way we develop code going forward. And the next one that I want to show is this gem here. There is the array find method, or function, I should call it. It's not a method. Array underscore find. This RFC proposes the addition of new array functions: array underscore find underscore key, and array underscore any. Bear with me whilst I deal with those dogs because they are barking. Oh, they've just stopped barking. Typical. No, they're barking again. Yeah, okay. Give me a sec. I'll come back and I will start this array find again. Bear with me a minute. I do apologise about that. That was a delivery. You can never time these things, right? Can you? And of course, when we got two English Springer Spaniels, they they let you know that there's someone at the door. Right. What was I talking about? The array underscore find. Yes, the array underscore find. This is awesome. Can't wait to get my teeth into this one. So this RFC proposes the addition of new array functions: array underscore find underscore key, array underscore any, and array underscore all. These are new functions in PHP, which are helper functions for common patterns for checking an array for the existence of elements matching a specific condition. Okay, it goes on to say, there are currently several functions processing arrays using a callback. However, still missing are functions to find a single element, matching a condition, and closely related functions of checking whether or not there are elements matching a condition. Implementing these functions in userland is relatively simple, but these functions are often required, leading to the wheel being reinvented over and over again. Furthermore, these type of functions are implemented in other programming languages like Rust, JavaScript, C++ too. Therefore, there is a reason to include these functions as standard with the next PHP version. In addition, the implementation of these functions are quite similar to the array underscore filter and relatively trivial to implement. So the maintenance effort should be low. I really like the way this RFC is worded, because it discusses that there are other programming languages that do this, and it also talks about how the maintenance effort should be low. It kind of takes it's written really well. It's very thought through. So anyway, we've got the array underscore find here. This is an example where you pass in an array as the first one, and then the callback for first argument, and the callback as a second argument. And then you've got the array. So there's some more examples here. Array find key. So that's finding a key based on the callback as well. And then you've got other examples, array underscore any. Yeah, I mean, this, I think, again, is another example of how we're going to recode or just write PHP in the future. I think this is going to help a lot of applications, and I can already think of several use cases where I've written the array underscore filter and doing some crazy shenanigans where actually I could just do use one of these methods, these functions. So yeah, this is a really good step forward, and I'm so glad it's in PHP. And notice this is the second RFC I've talked about today where they have spoken about other programming languages. So PHP is keeping up with everything else, and like Rust, JavaScript, C++. It's great. It's great that we are looking upon other programming languages, seeing what they're doing, and seeing if we can implement it in PHP and how best to do so. I applaud this change. The next one we are going to talk about quickly is, this is cool. This is going to change all sorts of things. I first read this and went, oh dear, how much code is there we need to alter? But actually, there should be relatively small changes. But lots of them. So this is a deprecation. Deprecate the implicitly nullable parameter types, right? So here we go. PHP supports nullable type declarations in 7.1 with the question mark T syntax, right? So you put in a question mark and it's a nullable type, right? And with the T pipe null syntax. So you would have, like, if you had several types and one of them being null, you would have a pipe, and then the types, or pipe type, and pipe null as one of them. So as of PHP 8.0, when generalized support for union types was added. Yeah, so the word I was trying to look for there was union types. Right. However, it has been possible to use scalar type declarations as a part of 7.0 and callable types as of 5.4, array as 5.1, and class types as PHP 5.0. As there wasn't a syntax for nullable type declarations at the time, PHP 5.1 enables null and only null as the default value for typed parameters, making them implicitly nullable. And actually, think about this, it makes a lot of sense. I'll talk about why in just a second. Let me finish reading this. So, however, the implicity, I can't say that, anyway, nullable semantics are confusing, as well as that word, confusing and conflict with other language rules, in particular because such type declarations can be misleading as to what types they actually accept. Furthermore, this syntax still permits signatures, such as the one shown here, where I will just describe it for those listening. So we got a function foo. We're passing in a type of one, or T1, as argument A, and then T2 as argument B, but that is nullable. So we have equals null, right? Because that's optional. And then we have T3 as a type of argument C, which is the third one. So the third argument is after the null. Not good. Which appears to suggest an optional parameter before the required one, even though signatures which contain an optional parameter before a required one deprecated in 8.0, the case of implicit, that's that bloody word again, isn't it? Nullable types was left alone at the time due to BC concerns. The exclusion caused some bugs in the detection of which signatures should admit the deprecation notice. Indeed, the following signature only emits a deprecation of 8.1. Okay, so we're comparing these two signatures, right? The signature that I've just discussed, and a new signature where we've got a question mark against the T2 parameter. And we're saying that this is only going to cause deprecation in 8.1. But actually, they both do very similar things. So essentially, I'm not going to, again, this is quite long, so I'm not going to read it through. But again, essentially what we're saying is that when we have a function, and it's got a parameter, and in that parameter, or that parameter, can be nullable, right? We don't have to have equals null. All we need to do is just have question mark as by the type, because there's no need to have equals null. So deprecate implicitly, I've said it right that time, great, nullable types which are written with the following signature. So function, and then we've got argument t equals null by omitting the following deprecation notice at compile time. So it will say implicitly marking parameter var as nullable is deprecated. Okay, so that is what we're doing. Implicitly marking parameter var as nullable is now deprecated. The explicit nullable type must be used instead. When we say the explicit nullable type, what am I talking about? That is the question mark as the type. And this RFC goes into impact analysis, migration paths, and all of that fun stuff. Yeah, I'll link all of this to the show notes below, and you can take a look at it yourself. This will cause a lot of changes, small changes that require regression, which require testing, which will be a bit of a headache in legacy code. However, again, right at the start of this, when we were having a look at one of the other, I think when we were looking at the RFC regarding the new without parentheses, what we're doing, it's just kind of a similar thing here, is we are reducing the amount of code that we have to read in order to work out what the code is doing, right? So there's no need to have equals null when we are explicitly saying that it is a null. Yeah, so there's no need for that. Likewise, when we're doing, if it's an array, we don't say equals square brackets, do we? Because it's an array. Yeah. So again, really quite useful. I'm super glad with that. Okay, so we've got a couple more. So we've got the HTML5 support. We've got some JIT changes, and we've got some lazy objects. I'm not going to go through those primarily because I really don't know much about them myself. And for time reasons, but I'll leave links in the show notes as well. The next one I want to talk about today, the next thing I want to talk about is Symfony. Symfony. I am a big Symfony lover, also a Laravel lover too, and this came my way over Twitter, and I thought, these are quite interesting, and some of them fairly funny. These are security advisories. So I'm at symfony.com/blog/category/security advisories. I'll leave links in the show notes below. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 security advisories that have recently been mentioned. All, I believe, on November the 6th of... no, that one was November the 10th, 2023. We might be able to leave that one out. Okay. So some of these are, most of these affect older versions. And when I mean older versions of Symfony, I mean things like 3.1 or 3.11, sorry. But some of them affect things that go all the way up to Symfony 7. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'll read you the headliners, shall we? So the first one is the unguarded calls to the isSet and to array accesses in sandbox. The next one is unguarded calls to toString method in a sandbox when an object is an array or an argument list. This one here, which is the CV 2024-51754 Twig, it affects Twig versions. And it has been fixed in Twig 3.11 and 3.14. And it's a problem with the toString method, it would appear. So not only is this Symfony, but it's also affects Twig too. The next one is the open redirect via browser sanitized URLs. This is CVE 2024-50345. And this one affects everything from less than 5.4 all the way to, 7.1? And some bits in between, right? So I can see it here. So it affects 5.4.46, 6.4, 5.4.14 and 7.1.7. They are the versions in which this has been fixed in. Okay, so the description. The request class does not parse URI with special characters in the same way browsers do. As a result, an attacker can trick a validator relying on the request class to redirect users to another domain. That does not sound particularly fun. The next one is the incorrect response from validator when input ends with a breaking line. So /n. And this one is CVE 2024 50343. And this affects versions 5.4.43, 6.4.11, and 7.1.4. That's the versions in which they're fixed within. Okay. So I should stop saying that they affect these versions. These have been fixed within those versions, I should say. Okay, the description. It is possible to trick a validator configured with a regular expression using the the dollar symbol meta characters with an input line ending with an input with /n. I don't really know any applications that. Oh, hang on a minute. No, this is configured with a regular expression using the dollar symbol meta characters with an input ending with. Okay, yeah, I'll be quiet. Right, moving on. There is the internal address and network enumeration allowed by no private network HTTP client. This is pretty interesting. So when using the no private network HTTP client, some internal information is still leaking during host resolution, which leads to a possible IP port enumeration. This is fixed in 5.4.46, 6.4.14, and 7.1.7. The moral of this story is to update your code, your packages. This one, which made me chuckle, CVE 2024 50340, ability to change environment from query. Okay, so this is fixed in 5.4.46, 6.4.14, and 7.1.7 again. Okay, when the register _argc_argv, right, so this is a PHP directive, is set to on, and the users call any URL with a special crafted query string, they are able to change the environment or debug mode used by the kernel when handling the request. Let me just say that again, because this is when the register _argc_argv PHP directive is set to on, and users call any URL with a specially crafted query string. Obviously, they're not going to give you an example of what that would be. They are able to change the environment or debug mode used by the kernel when handling the request. So please go and check your PHP ini files and make sure that register _argc_argv is not set to on. And if it is, please update this code or update your code to sort this out, because that doesn't sound particularly. That sounds particularly nasty. The next one is the security login does not take into account customer user checker. This is CVE 2024 50341. So the custom user _checker defined on a firewall is not called when login programmatically with the security login method, leading to unwanted login. This is fixed in 6.4.10, 7.0.10, and 7.1.3. Again, a relatively nasty one. And I believe we've got one left here. Twig security releases, possible sandbox bypasses. Under some circumstances, the sandbox security checks are not run, which allows user-contributed templates to bypass the sandbox restrictions. Okay, so please go and read this if you're using Twig on the versions mentioned. So from version 1 to 1.4.7 or 1.44.7, I should say, out between versions 2 and versions 2.16 and versions 3 to versions 3.11 and versions 3.12 to versions 3.14. If you're using Twig within those kind of versions, then please do upgrade your code, because, like I said, under some circumstances, sandbox security checks are not run, which allows user-contributed templates to bypass sandbox restrictions. Whew! Okay. So again, I'll leave a link to these in the show notes. I applaud Symfony for putting this out. It makes me, it enforces the need to keep your application updated, and it's showing that Symfony is striving forward to not only push their current versions through, but also securing the old ones too, which I am super pleased about, even though some of these might sound a little bit scary. Some of these only affect older versions, and if you are continuing on your upgrade cycles, if you are keep focusing on that, so every time a release is done you're upgrading and all of this stuff, and it's not a big bang upgrade, then you should be fine. So it's more of a, it's something that you really should be aware of if you're using Symfony, or anything really. Any code has security issues, or will eventually have security issues. Upgrading your code is so important, keeping it up to date, keeping it patched, keeping it secure, and it shouldn't be treated as one of these things that we'll do on a rainy day. It should be implemented on a regular basis. And also there should be time allocated to jump on fixes like this when things are immediately offered as patches. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to move away from a little bit of PHP, and we're actually going to talk about some API stuff. I'm going to go back into this mode here. We're going to talk about APIs, because this is something that I have struggled with. I have struggled with APIs in my past. When is the best time to create an API? When is the best time to utilize APIs? I want to talk about API first approach, the API first approach. And I wrote a little thing this morning about the problems, the downsides of using API first approach, and the benefits of using the API first approach, and also an explainer as to what that is. And I also want to sort of talk about my experiences of APIs and how I've trapped myself essentially with either not creating an API soon enough or creating an API too soon. And it's that juggle of when is best to implement an API on your system. Okay, so here we go. Typically, an API is an afterthought of a software project. Traditionally, an API is only built when it becomes a critical requirement of an already established system. This can lead to hybridization of data connections and, at worst, duplicated data entry points to system data that lead to complicated migrations. I hope you can hear my pain in that. So let's do that again. Typically, an API is an afterthought of a software project. Right. So this means that you've got an idea for a software project and you go ahead and build it. The whole emphasis is trying to get it out to market as soon as possible. So you do that. So you don't build it as an API because there's no need for it to be an API at that present second. You just want to get it out the door as quickly as possible. It could be even as small as a landing page with a user sign up, right? That kind of thing, with a timer of when the product is going to be released. And in the background, you're busy building the application. And then when it comes to market, you may find yourself in need of an API, or at least using other people's APIs, and you're stuck because your code at the minute doesn't lend itself well to an API. It might be completely embedded in, say, SQL. So you're communicating to your data source, or even if it's just assets, via the traditional method of querying the database using code that is very coupled to the database, to the data store, or dealing with images in a coupled manner. That kind of issue where you build the code as quickly and as efficiently as possible, but you blink yourself from the possibility of ever needing an API. And so traditionally an API is only built when it becomes a critical requirement of an established system. So the system is now established. You now have all the user signups, and you have released to market. But now you are thinking, maybe we need to provide our data to an external source, or maybe we need to start decoupling our systems, and maybe we are seeing a traffic spike on the front end, and which means that the people on the back end who are dealing with content management, they are causing a bottleneck, or just contributing to the traffic. And if we can move that load somewhere else, and if we can communicate through a common set of interfaces, and if we could put some caching in between all of that stuff, then it would make things a lot easier and more extendable and more accessible in the future. However, it's an established system. And so you now have to make the decision as to how do we actually implement an API into a system that is already in place, already live, and already being used in anger by not only our back-end team, but also the public, right? So we have to be very careful here. Very, very careful. This can lead to, therefore, a hybridization of data connections and, at worst, duplicate entry points to systems that lead to complicated migrations. So now you're in a situation where, okay, we now need to provide an external entry point to our data. Perhaps we've got a third party that needs to have access to our data. Okay, cool. Or maybe we are deciding to move our content management system somewhere else that decouples the front end. But we need to access the data in a common language. All right, so how do we implement that? Well, some of the code is still going to be embedded with the SQL, right? Some of the code is going to be very coupled to perhaps it's going to be the front end, right? Perhaps the front end now is closer to the database than the back end, or maybe the back end, or the CMS, I should say, vice versa. The CMS is more closer to the data, right? And so the front end now needs to be rebuilt in order to make those connections. You now have a challenge on your hands, because you have multiple ways, multiple entry points, multiple pathways to access your data and your system and your call upon your business logic. Not only is it going to be calling the database through SQL, but it's also going to be calling the data through a REST API. Okay, so now we have data in two sets of payloads, and now we have data that, and with the API, of course, you really, really, really should not be. You should not be. Let me get my words right. You really should not be describing your entities, your data, and how it's structured in an API response. Okay. Whereas if your code that you're writing on the back end is very close to the database, which is very close to the content management system, then that's fine because it's private. You see what I mean? So now you're in this situation where we have to rebuild parts of the front end so it becomes more API driven, but the back end is still very much embedded in the SQL land. So now we have some issues, because one is coded in one way and one is coded in the other way, which just causes a bit of a mess and is going to be very confusing to anyone coming to the project. If, however, it was built in an API first kind of manner, then the CMS and the front end would be probably calling common API calls, passing in very different authentication values, obviously, to say that, hey, this is from a CMS and hey, this is from the front end, and we need to authenticate these requests differently. But now you have a common interface. Now you have a common way of finding the lists of your products for both the front end and the back end, rather than having two very separate ways of doing things. And if you don't do the API first approach, then you'll end up with this hybridization approach with complicated migrations, because it's very difficult to sell a client the need to convert their existing code into an API, a REST API, because you're not going to provide any direct, immediate value to the client. All you're doing is making it future-proof, and you're able to perhaps sell them on maybe making it a little bit faster, maybe selling them on making the code a little bit more unified. But all of these things are they're not very tangible. They're not very tangible. However, if you start with an API first approach, you don't have to have all those discussions, because it's all API first, right? So when a system is built using an API first approach, the development of the API is given priority over the other areas of the system and is built before anything else. When the foundations of a system are built on an API, the data and business logic is decoupled from any front end or external system, which expands the application's capabilities and accessibility to end users and external systems. So we are now in a position where we can say, okay, well, the front end could be written in React. The back end could be written in something completely different. It doesn't matter. The data, the common interface, is the glue between the two, right? It doesn't matter what the front end is built in or what the back end is built in, because they are both going to consume the API and consume those payloads and send requests to a common interface. So we've already, from the get-go, decoupled how we're going to implement these things, which means that you could have specific development teams working on specific areas of the code. And then you could have an API team that builds the glue between all the other bits and pieces. It sounds good, doesn't it? There are some disadvantages. We'll get to those in a minute. Yes, so let me mention that again. When a system is built using an API first approach, the development of the API is given priority over other areas of the system and is built before anything else. So this means that, okay, we've got this requirement coming down the line. The first thing we need to do is build the API. Before we do anything else, we have to build the API. And that needs to be a discipline that the development team has to have going forward. So before anything else, the API gets built. It's an API first mentality. When the foundations of a system are built on an API, the data and business logic is decoupled from any front end or external system, which expands the application's capabilities and accessibility to end users and external systems. So there is a temptation when you don't build your application in an API first approach. There is a temptation of having the business logic sit very close to the front end, or even have the front end deal with that. That's a bad idea, of course, but it's very close to also spread the business logic around the application, which again is not great, but there's a temptation there. What we're doing with an API first approach is creating some boundaries, some defined places where the data is going to be accessed from, right? We're saying that this is an API, and this is your API client. And this API client could be written in PHP, it could be written in Rust, it could be written in JavaScript. Who cares? It doesn't matter. But the API itself, this is where the boundaries are. And at the API level, we can say who can access the data, what the data can do, and then it can call upon other systems within our main application, right? Internally. Also, with an API, we can provide external sources. Say, if you're recommending your products to another site, for example, you can say, this is your API, this is your access to our data, and we can restrict that like we've restricted all the other APIs that happen both internally and externally. And of course, you can then provide this to end users in a very different manner. If, for example, you one day decided that actually we don't only need a e-com store, we also need to have a mobile application, right? So now we can give our mobile app the access that we give our other front ends to a degree. Obviously restrict them in certain cases, but the idea is that you're building upon a common interface that can be used by multiple sources, be it internal, private, or external. When I say private, I mean like we're giving this website, this external website, access to our data privately through some form of API request that they send us through like an API token, that kind of private stroke public access type thing. Internally, I mean, we're building an API which calls other systems internally that aren't exposed to the general public. And then publicly, I mean, this is like a public set of data that we can provide in an open source kind of fashion, perhaps. Okay, so the API first approach forces developers to rethink how to build applications, as the API needs to be treated as a first-class citizen and not an afterthought. The API must be reusable, secure, and should allow connections from multiple sources. This could include, as I mentioned, internal, private, or public access. So the API first approach forces developers to rethink how they build applications, as the API needs to be treated as a first-class citizen and not as an afterthought. We don't think about the API after we've built the code. We think about the API before we write the code, okay? And when we build the API, we are designing and describing how the data is provided. Okay, so there are some downsides to an API first approach. The first one is the more time is needed at the early stages of the project to design and implement an API. This time could be spent building other parts of the application that could bring immediate value. Yes, this is one of the traps I fell in. So I built something ages ago, and I built it as an API first approach. I thought, yeah, this is the new hotness. We'll build it as an API. Never needed it. Never needed an API. I had ideas as to where I could send this data as an API, but that never actually happened. And I spent so much time building the API, and it never came to fruition. So that is a problem. That is a real problem, and it's a problem when you're working on your own project and you're not working within a team who can perhaps rein you in and you don't have clear goals. It's a problem when you don't have clear goals as to where you want this application to go in the future, and as clear aspirations as well. So more time is needed at the earlier stages of the project to design and implement an API. This time could be spent building other parts of the application that could bring immediate value. The trade-off is knowing if and when the connections will be needed to be rebuilt and how big of a task that will be. So the trade-off here, if you decide not to go down the API first approach, and not all APIs need to be built. Not all applications need to be built with APIs, of course. And if you decide that actually you don't want to build an API, but then later on discover that you actually need one, then you are in the same predicament as I mentioned earlier, where you end up having to rebuild some code, migrate some connections, and you end up on a hybridized sort of system. Not every application needs an API. It would be a waste of development time if one was built but never utilized. Considerations on future system requirements are needed before deciding if the application could benefit from an API. So this is proper decision time. When you start building your application, you really need to think, do I need to waste my time building it as an API, or could I just build it close to the data and see how that goes? It's a trade-off. You have to accept the fact that if you do need an API in the future, you are going to spend a lot of pain, but spend of time doing a lot of pain, a lot of rework, a lot of migration. But if you decide that you do need an API, you have to accept the fact that you are going to have to do a lot of designing of the API, a lot of building of the API up front before you do anything else. Which could, for some clients, be a big ask, right? It could be a big ask. Okay, so the benefits of an API first approach. The application has an element of future proofing as a new feature may need an API in order to fulfill its requirements. As all data connections are now based on an API, there is a decoupling between the front and back end systems. This means that multiple tech stacks can be used by multiple teams that all use a common interface. Yeah, so I've worked on teams before where there has been like an API team, and the API team builds the API based on the requirements of the other teams, and that's worked out really, really well. Where you don't actually have, if you're working on a team that isn't the API team, you don't have the ability to upgrade the API, right? But you have the ability to request through chain of command how to implement a new part of the API, right? And also, when you come into a team that has an API, as an API first approach, you have a series of rules and standards and boundaries that have already been put in play, right? So you access users using this request. You access a list of products using this request. If you want to use pagination, you do that. If you want to search for a product, this is how you query it. That kind of thing. And then it doesn't matter how the data is displayed on the page, right? Or what stack is being used for that to happen. It just... that decision is not the API team's decision. That decision is the team that is developing that particular feature. And you may think that, hang on, that's a bit segregated, but actually it works pretty well. The teams that I've worked in, where you've got, say, a team dealing with how the data is structured, how the data is represented, how the data is actually documented, and then you've got another team who have the knowledge of how the payload gets returned, and then from there, how to construct the page. And they don't have to worry about how the data is sent down the wire. They just have to worry about how the data is represented on the page. And then also on post requests and patches and stuff like that, and deletions, we would sit together with the API team, and they would go, right, it needs to be done in this kind of manner. You need this kind of these headers for that kind of stuff, and they would then explain to us, this is what happens in this kind of scenario. These kind of responses happen in this scenario. You get this response in this scenario, and all of this is documented. It's documented. So when a developer comes to the team, they are provided with a document of all of the calls that they can make, and they are provided with all the responses that can be supplied. And they also have perhaps a sandbox, if we're doing it through, say, the API platform, for instance, a sandbox of making requests and whatnot. It is really good. An API first approach is actually really good, but it's really good for big teams, where you've got teams of people doing various different pieces of work, all sending data through a common interface, which is the whole point of an API, right? That is really good. When you're doing a single project, or when you're doing a project on your own, or with a very small team, then it becomes a bit of a challenge, because you can't really segregate. You deal with the API, you deal with the front end, that kind of stuff. When you're working with small teams, everybody wears a similar hat, right? And it gets very tempting to start coupling bits and pieces together and to move away from the API first approach. I'm aware of people who've started with the API first approach and then moved away from it. So a new feature would come in and it had such a tight deadline that they just threw it together really close to where the data is stored. And now they end up with putting themselves into this hybridization approach, which is not good. And it always ends up as a rainy day project to re-implement a request in an API kind of manner. Yeah. Anyway, happy coding. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you ever so much for watching. And as always, this is going to be members only after I'll give it a few hours. And then it'll be members only for probably the next 3 weeks. If you fancy listening to this before anyone else does, then do check out both Patreon as well as the YouTube membership. Through those, you'll also get early access to tutorials and courses on there too. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.